to another broadcast of mindyourhealthcast.com. We're going to continue today on the theme that was started last broadcast, which is, of course, sheep for the slaughter. Now, why did I choose that term? Because in all the years of being exposed and working within the field of health and medicine, I have come to the conclusion that unfortunately that is where the realm of medicine has gotten to today, and I see the people as being herded about as sheep, and of course out of that are two things. It's the shearing. You keep making money off them as long as feasible, and then of course eventually they're butchered, usually for meat. And that's kind of where I see medicine has gotten to, unfortunately. And we're going to talk more about some specifics this time. We started last time laying the general foundation of where medicine was, and I kind of separate this between pre-end of World War II and post-end of World War II. It seems that through the 1800s and the early 1900s up until World War II, medicine seemed to be one way, and was, and then after World War II, when some things developed within chemistry and so forth, it has led medicine to take a different tack, and ultimately it grew into something entirely different. And as a consequence, even the doctors that were attracted to medicine changed in nature. Not to say that they're all like that, but we're going to be talking about that bad side. I've been around, as I say, long enough to know what the doctors were like originally and to know what they have become today. So I see that as kind of a dividing point. Up to that period of time, the doctors really went into it as a healing art. There was not big money in medicine. There were no expensive tests and imaging. There were no big expensive drugs. In fact, the handbook or materia medica that the doctors worked out of was very limited. In fact, most of the medications that were on the market were made from herbs. They either were herbs outright or they were extracts from herbs. There were some mineral compounds. But I have a copy in my library of a book called the Merck Manual that has been put out every year since way back in the 1800s. And this was the 1899 version, and it's about 1/4 of an inch thick and about this large, which means you could fit it in your shirt pocket or your hip pocket. And that kind of represented, which was a few hundred items of what the medicine was that was used by doctors. Mostly, medicine was composed of lifestyle, changing lifestyle, dealing with stress and other issues that the people were involved with, stopping some unhealthy practices, and in a few cases they were given some kind of aid for the body. And herbs, of course, can be used in two ways. If you use them on one way, they're like a homeopathic. They have a tendency to help the body correct itself. If you increase the dose up and up, you can reach a level where you can begin to manage and manipulate symptoms. And that, I believe, is what they realized, that if they concentrated factors from herbs, they could then control symptoms, and people would be happy because they felt better, not necessarily because they were healthier, but because they felt better. But it was during World War II that chemistry really developed to the point they realized they could synthesize new molecules. And so that started to reveal the other face of medicine. And I say two faces because I think of old Greek drama and theater, and it's always represented by two faces or two masks, one of happiness and laughter and the comedy, and the other of the sadness and tragedy. And so I see medicine this period of time we're talking about, the end of World War II, as being more the mask of happiness and pleasure and comedy, And after that period of time, it began to move into the mask of tragedy. In fact, it became important to medicine to make people sick conscious and think about being sick and be reminded of being sick, because that drew them to the business. And so the post World War II period is when I see that medicine made its transition from being a healing art and being affordable to big business and becoming very unaffordable, as is now evidenced by the health bill, or at least they say health bill, I say the sickness bill of the country. And unfortunately, it's worse in the U.S. than other places, and we're going to talk about that in a minute as far as costs. Our costs here are much higher, and the drugs especially. I'm going to be talking just in a few minutes about a book that was published a few years ago where they did a comparison of around the world. And compared to France, for example, we pay 60 to 70% more for drugs in this country than they pay there, because the government regulates the price there so that it can't get out of hand. And in this country, the drug companies are free to charge whatever they decide to charge. And every attempt to somehow regulate has been thwarted by lobbyists and big donations to the legislators, so that they can't get bills through that would in some way curtail some of the costs. So all we do is just hang on and keep feeding money into the machine. And of course, as I'm sure you realize if you've been paying attention at all, that the health of the people in this country is not better. It's not improved. We would expect, if you're going to put $1 trillion into treatment and so forth, that you would expect that the people's health would be moving to a higher level. But if you look at all the statistics, you find that health has gone downhill. More chronic illnesses than ever. We seem to have most people spending a high percentage of their time either taking medications or going to doctors to get medications. And of course, and in the light of the fact that the body is getting sicker, then there's more surgeries, and now we have resorted to organ replacements because we can't prevent anything from happening, because we are not geared to actually get people well. We are geared to manage symptoms. Now, I keep saying that, and I'm emphasizing it because I'm still not sure that it clicks yet. We had way back in our early broadcast, we talked about homotoxicology, and we talked about symptoms. And of course, symptoms are, in almost every case, the body's immune system attempting to get rid of a problem, meaning something that's gotten into the body that shouldn't be there. And so the body initiates an inflammatory response, which is redness, heat, swelling, and pain, to get rid of that. And in that process of attempting to get rid of the whatever it is that you've picked up, whether it be a poison of some sort or a virus or whatever, then we're going to have some discomfort. And if it's significant, we're going to have some fever. But those are not bad. Those are the body attempting to correct itself. So what do we do today? We go to a doctor and he gives us some kind of medication that is going to suppress those symptoms, going to turn them off. Now, if you think about that logically, if you have a poison in your body and your body initiates an inflammatory response to get rid of it, and you turn off the inflammatory response, then what have we done to the problem? We have allowed it to remain in the body. And then later we pick up something else, the body starts to react, we go and get some medication to turn it off, we feel better, but we're sicker. And so down the road, what happens? One day we go and have some examination and we find that our body is full of cancer, or we have some serious degenerative condition going on. And why did that happen? If you remember from homotoxicology, if you continually suppress things, they eventually begin to poison the cells in your body, and as the cells become poisoned, they begin to malfunction, and the ultimate of that is that the cell is so poisoned that it no longer functions as a human cell. It disconnects from the body, is no longer controlled by the body, and because it becomes a separate entity within our body, which we now call cancer. But that is only the result of never allowing the body to clear itself of the things it's picked up. I know when I studied in Germany, a lot of the German doctors made the comment that especially in the U.S. and some other places that we don't allow fevers. From the time children are small, instead of allowing the body fever to develop and to get rid of the problem, we end up suppressing the fever. And of course, the doctors came up with the story of scaring people. Oh, if your fever gets very high, you could go into convulsions and could be brain damage and blah, blah, blah. And so every parent got scared and had to run and take something like aspirin originally, and then they found aspirin was creating some serious neurological problems from suppression of viruses. So then they started with Tylenol, which of course destroys your liver. So then they eventually went to things like Motrin and so forth, or the ibuprofen group of drugs. But the bottom line is the fevers were not that bad. I've been in the field now almost 40 years, pushing 40 years. We've had people with every kind of inflammation, which again is not bad. And by giving the body natural support, I have never had to have the people resort to taking a fever-suppressing drug. Neither have I had to have them go get antibiotics. I'm alive, and I know for at least 50 to 55 years I have not had an antibiotic, and yet I'm still alive. And I have never taken an aspirin as far as I know, and I've never suppressed a fever. And I remember when I was young, I got some pretty high fevers, but then they weren't doing that so much when I was young, trying to suppress everything. So I'm just telling you that to give you some contrast, because many people were born into the modern medical system and they think that's all there is. They have no idea that there's other options. I mentioned a little bit about Dr. Mendelsohn last time. He became aware, and his material is eye-opening. If you have not read any of his books, they're still available through Amazon. If you go to my website, there's a page of Amazon books, and if it isn't on there, we need to get it on there. But Mendelsohn's books, of course, he's been dead for a while now, but they are really a good synopsis of Confessions of a Medical Heretic, which was his first book. Then he later came back with one called Medical Malpractice, How Women Were Exploited by Medicine. And then the third book he wrote was How to Raise a Healthy Child in Spite of Your Doctor. And of course he made the comment in the Confessions of a Medical Heretic that the worst thing you could do for your health was to go to a hospital. And anyhow, as you can probably guess, he was not popular with the rest of the medical profession, because he was advocating that people become responsible and take their health in their own hands and start to learn what they can do to be healthy, as opposed to getting a drug every time you have a symptom and getting the symptom suppressed. Now I realize, because I've gone through a lot of the cleansing myself, that sometimes the idea of your body going through a cleansing process is certainly not pleasant, and it certainly can be uncomfortable sometimes, to the point that you're thinking, well, maybe it would be nice if you suppressed it. But on the other hand, when I know what's going on, I'm going to write it out, and I have. And so here I am, 74 years old, and I'm still alive. I have no serious degenerative disease of any kind. And I probably have more energy than most people that I know, a whole lot younger, because I see them come into my office in the 40s and 50s, that some are almost barely functional. And these are people who have spent a good share of their life, every time they had a symptom, going and getting some kind of a medication to suppress that symptom so they felt better. And not realizing it, I'm not blaming them per se, they just didn't realize what they were doing to their body. So I'm emphasizing that this is all post-World War II, that this big change has started to occur. Now what happened is they started to realize they could synthesize drugs. In other words, originally they found out years ago from herbalists that people with a weakened heart could strengthen their heart and make it work better by taking a herb called foxglove, which had digitalis as one of its factors. And so medicine borrowed from the herbalists the use of digitalis. via the herb foxglove. And at some point they figured out that probably digitalis was the major part of that herb that was helping a weakened heart, such as congestive heart failure, beat stronger. So after a while they thought, well, maybe we should just synthesize. Remember, synthesize means you can create a molecule by taking either usually coal tar products or petroleum products, taking molecules or atoms from those and rearranging them in a way that you could generate something else, a synthetic drug. And so what they did is they copied the molecule of the digitalis out of foxglove and came up with their own synthetic version. And of course, what did they do? They patented that. And once they patented it, guess what? It was no longer generic, so they could charge whatever they wanted. And so the digitalis that they created was extremely toxic, had a very narrow therapeutic window, which means if you go beyond that window, it becomes toxic. And I know at one of the programs I went to along the way, I was talking to a heart specialist, and he said that a high percentage of the people who get referred to him were coming from doctors who had been prescribing the synthetic digitalis to the patient, but had been over-prescribing it to the point that they were being poisoned by it. So all he had to do is reduce the level of it because of the fact that they were being poisoned. So how many people died from being poisoned from the drug? There's no way of knowing because no records were ever kept of that. So that's just one example of what can happen. But once they could synthesize and patent, it changed the whole face of the pharmaceutical industry. Now you're not just collecting some herbs and making extracts of them and having people take those, but you can't charge the big prices because there's no way to protect yourself with using the herbs. Everybody can go out and collect the herbs, every company, and so the price was regulated by competition. But once they realized they could synthesize a drug and patent it, then no other company could use that until the patent ran out. Therefore, they had the ability to charge whatever they chose. Now, an interesting book was written back in the 90s called Making Medicine, Making Money. And of course, the thesis of this is that they're saying, I'm just quoting right off of the back by the authors, prescription drug prices rose 3 times faster than inflation in the last decade, making the drug industry the nation's most profitable business. In Making Medicine, Making Money, investigative reporters Donald Drake and Marion Allman show how the industry has circumvented every governmental effort to bring prices under control, how drug companies raise prices, not lower them when faced with competition, how they are granted monopoly markets and given the right to profit from research breakthroughs by government and academic scientists. In other words, they can take a drug that the research was paid for by the government or paid for by some academic institution, and then they can turn around and take the drug and put a premium price on it, and the taxpayers have paid for the research. And what is their reward for paying for that? They pay an outlandish price to buy it back. Now, I don't know if this is hitting home or not, but it's just ridiculous, and my whole purpose in this is to get you to start thinking. Now, I noticed in this book, in chapter 5, how other nations hold down drug costs. And they talk about France as an example. And 2 to 3 times a week, this is coming, excuse me, right from the book, 2 to 3 times a week, there's a group of officials sit down and they look at the drug prices and they look at them around the world and they establish how much the drug companies can charge for the drugs in France. And the bottom line is, they said that French drug prices are among the lowest not only in Europe, but they're 60 to 70% cheaper than prices in the United States. Now, why is that? I mentioned earlier, there are no price controls. The United States is one of the few industrialized nations in the world that do nothing to control the price of prescription drugs. So Americans routinely pay higher prices for drugs than people in all the other countries. So it's interesting that they've been allowed to get away with it. And as I say, how do they do it? They have made so much money that they can take the profits and they can make big donations to the PAC funds of legislators, and they can influence people with payoffs, and consequently they have a free rein to charge whatever they choose. Now, several years ago, I guess it was Puerto Rico, was one of the places, allowed the drug companies to come to their country and manufacture and not even have to pay any income tax on their profits. So consequently, they could go over there, make the drug, ship it even cheaper, ship it back over here, and still charge the highest exorbitant prices in this country and get away with it. And of course, again, nothing has ever been done. You know, you don't want to offend the people who are paying the big bill for you, and they're donating all this money. So if you haven't read it, if you can still find a copy of it, it's called Making Medicine, Making Money. And there's a lot more information in it. They have all kinds of graphs and charts showing you how the costs have just gone outlandish, and not because it's costing them so much more to make, but because they can get away with charging whatever they want. Once they patent the drug and put it on the market, it's up to them, whatever they want to do with it. And of course, who pays the bill? We do. And as I say, in many cases, we even paid the money out of tax money to do the research for the drug, and then they're allowed to patent it and make the big money off of it. So those are some of my gripes. Now, as I was watching the medical industry change, all these things started happening. Big new diagnostic equipment came along, and of course, if you're going to have a $1 million or a $2 million piece of equipment, then you have to run a lot of people through the testing on it, and you also have to charge a lot of money for it. So the diagnostic side of medicine increased tremendously in terms of cost. And then, of course, what happened, I guess, that began to bother them a bit was that there were some alternative natural therapies coming along, and one had been around for a long time, which was homeopathic medicine. And so because it's so inexpensive comparative-wise, they did everything they could to discourage the public from going to anyone who worked with medicine, especially homeopathic. In this country, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the people who went to homeopathic doctors were basically business people, educators, people who did very well in life, who were very, as I say, very educated. Those are the kind of people who went to it. While medicine realized that there was no giant money to be made with homeopathy because it's all generic. There is no way you can patent it because the principles have been around for a long, long time, and the substances are in micro amounts, so it does not cost a lot to make it. So the move was to cause the public to think that it was worthless, and they started out campaigns which ended up being very successful. That actually it ended up that they took control to the point that they started a campaign to go out and investigate hospitals and medical schools. And we don't have time to even get into it in any detail. It was called the Flexner Report. And there was a lot of shenanigans went on with it. But the bottom line, they tried to tell the public that the homeopathic schools were not high quality and the homeopathic hospitals were not high quality. So they ended up bit by bit getting them shut down or taking them over. At one time, there was approximately 40 medical schools in this country that were homeopathic, and there was probably a couple of hundred hospitals. And I would say the bulk of the public went for homeopathic medicine. It was inexpensive comparative-wise, and it was effective. So the people weren't turning off symptoms. They were actually helping their bodies get better. So the actual health of people improved. But once they were closed out, because eventually they made it so unpopular and spent so much money turning the public against it, that it fell back into the background. And then they had free rein to market their expensive drugs. And that was one of the big moves that came along. Another one that came along was that there were naturopaths. In naturopathic medicine, there were doctors that came over from Germany and Austria and a lot of Switzerland, and they were all trained in natural processes. And again, these were health-producing and preventative in nature. So they didn't want that to keep going, so they started a campaign to get rid of all kinds of doctors who were not using the prescription drugs. And one of the groups they eliminated almost was naturopathic medicine. They used diet, fasting, water treatments, nutrients, all the things that could help make you healthier is what they used, and comparative-wise, it was much less expensive. And again, because of what they used, there was nothing to patent, and therefore you could not charge outlandish prices. So as time went on, they worked very hard to eliminate it totally. They also had another group developed actually out of medicine. A Dr. Still, who was an MD, began to get the idea that maybe if the body is malaligned, it causes displacement of organs in the body, which then begin to malfunction, and that a lot of health problems are related to structural problems. And so he started something called osteopathy. Now, we mentioned earlier, I guess, about the different kinds of doctors, but he, even though he was an MD, felt that the doctors needed to learn more about the structure and realigning the structure to be where it should be, and that would allow the organs to move back into place and to function better. And it became very popular, but again, no big medicine money, because they were not using a lot of drugs. In fact, again, what they were using was some homeopathy and nutrition and some herbs. And so it was a very low-key as far as cost, but effective. However, they again started the same campaign to discredit it, and they worked very hard to make it illegal to practice osteopathy. And for a while, it looked like they might succeed, but then enough of the die-hard osteopaths decided that they were going to move to establish the profession, and over the years they did. However, at some point, medicine came up with a plan. This was an interesting one. This took place out in California. The medical people in California came up with a program that if a person were a doctor of osteopathy, a DO, they could trade in their DO for an MD and become an MD. Now, there was a school of osteopathy also in California, so the idea was if they could get the DOs to convert to MDs and go under their control, and then they could take over the school, they could wipe out the profession of osteopathy. And a lot of the osteopaths did do that. I've known some myself who traded off their DO for an MD. And consequently, the diehards, however, refused to let it happen. And so in spite of all the attempt to get rid of it, it actually has experienced a comeback. And there are more schools have developed over the country, and more people come out as a DO. Now, the downside of that is that the DOs realized that medicine was making a whole lot more money, because when someone came in to see them, by the time they analyzed their structure and by the time they came up with the treatment, they would spend maybe a half hour with a person, sometimes longer, and get a certain fee. Well, the MDs were writing prescriptions, and so the people would go to the MD and they could be there 5 to 10 minutes, get their prescription, and out the door. So they could be seeing 5 or 6 people for the same fee that the osteopath was getting for a half hour to 45 minutes. So there started to be a transition in osteopathy to the point that now today, many osteopaths don't manipulate at all. They actually just write prescriptions and do surgery the same as the regular MDs do. So for all practical purposes, there's really no difference today if you go out and see a DO or an MD degree after the doctor's name, you're going to get the same kind of treatment because they were willing to trade it off. And why? To make more money, unfortunately. An interesting thing happened along the way. I was in my office one day. I got an appointment was made by a person to come in to some of the treatment that I was doing, and it was actually the wife of a DO. Well, when they got in and we started talking, I found out that the wife actually was a nurse, and he was a doctor of osteopathy, and that they had gotten into the field back when homeopathy was still thriving, and the natural treatments and the manipulation and so forth. Now, it ended up that they were in the Philadelphia area where the Hahnemann College of Medicine, which Dr. Hahnemann was the founder of homeopathy, and so he was trained in homeopathy, and he knew all the natural manipulations and so forth, and his wife was a nurse in the Hahnemann Hospital where the treatment was done by homeopathic medicine. So anyhow, his profession was starting to get into this transition, and when he saw what was happening, that the DOs were basically converting or becoming like an MD, prescribing drugs, he did not want any part of that. So he went back and did a specialty in radiology and became a radiologist, which meant he read x-rays. And that's what he finished his professional life as, a radiologist, and retired out without having to treat people anymore because he did not want to give the drugs. And he realized that he couldn't make the money that the other doctors that had sold out to allopathy, which is the use of the regular drugs, and therefore he didn't want a part of that, but on the other hand, he had to make a living, so he worked as a radiologist. On the other hand, his wife was a nurse at the Hahnemann Hospital, and she said that there was a lot of talk about the regular drugs, but this hospital was still a homeopathic hospital. And that more and more talk, and she said one night she went home, and the pharmacy of the hospital was all the rows of homeopathic medicines, and the pharmacist was a homeopathic pharmacist. They came in the next morning, and all of the homeopathics were gone. The homeopathic pharmacists were gone, and they had all these new high-powered prescription medications, and overnight the hospital went from homeopathic to allopathic. And that was basically the end of, that was the last hospital that was doing homeopathic medicine. And as I say, the irony of it is that the school, the medical school there, the Hahnemann Medical College, was named after Samuel Hahnemann, the originator of the system of homeopathic medicine, and they quit giving degrees in homeopathic medicine and went to giving degrees in standard medicine. And so it still has the same name today, the Hahnemann Medical School. And the hospital, of course, as I say, converted from homeopathy to allopathy, and that was the end. Now, it's an interesting part of the history of medicine in this country, but up until about the 30s, homeopathy was reigning very heavily, and a high percentage of the public went to homeopaths. And once they discredited it, or at least they attempted to, they didn't. There were some diehards that hung on with homeopathy, and you probably now know that it's kind of had a comeback. Still not so much with regular MDs, but with other alternative practitioners. Some even the DOs have gone back to homeopathy. A few MDs have gone to homeopathy again, but naturopathic medicine and oriental medicine, which also utilizes homeopathy, all of those have started using it, and it's become a more common word again. It started appearing in magazine articles and so forth, and occasionally you hear about it. There's even ads on TV for products that are homeopathic in nature. Maybe that doesn't click when you hear it, but there are a few that are back again. So the industry of homeopathic medicine has experienced somewhat of a revival, not where it should be, but it's interesting to see where it has gone. Now, it's interesting what they did to try to get rid of some of these other groups, such as chiropractic. Now, chiropractic has kind of been a thorn in the side of medicine for a long time. One of the reasons being that the chiropractors, from the time of D.D. Palmer, who was the originator of chiropractic out of Davenport, Iowa, the first school of chiropractic was in Davenport, Iowa, he realized, again, the structure, but especially the spine, had a lot to do with the function of the body and a lot of the problems that people have. And so they came up with the idea of subluxation of the vertebra and the adjustment of those vertebrae back into place. And so medicine disliked them tremendously. Again, it was a drugless healing method. And so back several years ago, about the same time they were trying to get rid of naturopathy, they decided they were going to try to discredit and eventually get rid of chiropractic. Now, chiropractors were smart, much smarter than the naturopaths, because number one, they cooperated more together, and number two, the schools pumped out more chiropractors. They opened more schools and they put out more. And so the whole thing kind of came to a head several years ago in Illinois, when it was open game for an MD to tell any patient who asked about chiropractic, stay away from them. They don't know anything. They have 6 months of training or only a few weeks of training, and all kinds of misinformation. And I know of one case where the doctor told a patient, "Oh, you wouldn't believe how many weekends in the emergency room I've had to treat people who had their necks broken by chiropractors adjusting their neck," which is a total lie, a blatant lie. And the funny thing about it, it was this particular lady happened to be a wife of a chiropractor that the guy told it to. But that was the common story. Don't go to chiropractors. They can injure you. They have no value. They don't know what they're doing. They have no training. And the joke of it is that the chiropractor has actually more training in the structure than the doctor, the regular doctor, does. But anyhow, a big lawsuit arose in Illinois several years ago, and the way it came about was the chiropractors were tired of being called quacks and patients being discouraged from going to them when they had structural problems and so forth. And so they hired an investigative reporter to do some digging. This investigative reporter went to the headquarters of the AMA in Chicago and told them he was an investigative reporter and he was doing a story on chiropractic and so forth. And so the medical people assumed that he was going to write a bad story about chiropractic. And so they opened all their files of what they had on chiropractic to this investigative reporter. As he started digging through the files, he ran into notes from all these meetings where the AMA had decided to set up a campaign to discredit chiropractic and to destroy it, to get rid of it. And all that information was available, so he was able to make photocopies to show that they had generated a conspiracy to get rid of chiropractic, and there also were the same information about naturopathy. And so out of this whole big lawsuit that the chiropractors filed against the AMA and the National Hospital Association, who would not let chiropractors come into a hospital to see their patients, and the College of Orthopedic Doctors, were all included in the lawsuit. Now, this went on for some time, and it finally came to trial. And the interesting thing out of this trial was, number one, the chiropractors were able to prove their case. Number one, they had been discriminated against. Number two, that there was actually a conspiracy to get rid of them. And number three, that research had shown that in most cases with back problems and so forth, chiropractic was more effective than orthopedic doctors were. And so out of that, the court ruled in their favor and ruled they didn't go for money damages. They just wanted to shut the doctors up, that they would not be allowed to tell patients information that was incorrect. Such as they only had a few weeks of training or a few months at the most, that they broke all these people's necks and all this stuff that they would tell patients. And so out of this court hearing that was decided in favor of chiropractic, they actually issued an injunction against the whole medical profession of MDs that it would be, number one, a violation of this court order if they made any disparaging remarks about chiropractic to their patients who ask about chiropractic, and number two, that they could be, they ended up, they could go into hospitals, but what happens is that the American Hospital Association actually folded and made an agreement before it came to trial that the doctors of chiropractic could come into the hospitals to see their patients. And of course, the injunction said that if an MD wanted to refer a patient of theirs to chiropractic, they could do it, which they couldn't do before because they would be in trouble with the AMA and with their licensing boards. So this decision came out, and the penalty was that the AMA had to make a full copy of the injunction. In other words, they had to photocopy all the pages of this big injunction. They had to send a first-class mail copy to every MD that's licensed in the country. And they had to publish in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association a copy of the injunction and publish it on 3 different issues, so that all the medical doctors were properly informed that they were not to be talking down chiropractic and they couldn't say anything negative against it, and that the doctor could refer someone to a chiropractor without having to be penalized or reprimanded by their licensing board or the AMA. So I thought it was interesting that this happened, but anyhow, they tried to get rid of it. Now, most people don't realize how heavily they got into trying to eliminate all these things. They actually tried to discourage people from taking vitamins and nutrients, because back in the 30s, Dr. Royal Lee out of Wisconsin had started making supplements, food supplements. And so they harassed him like crazy for years, tried to keep him from doing that. And of course, they told the public it was a total waste of money and time. If you buy vitamins, you realize that all you're doing is just creating expensive urine. You don't need it. They're a waste of time and a waste of money. And they did this for years. And some of you probably can still remember hearing that, either from doctors or even on television or radio, how it was such a waste of money to buy these food supplements. Now, the interesting thing about that is that as time went on, and I've seen this transition, I don't know if you did or not, but I saw it. As time went on, people were spending money for vitamins anyhow. So consequently, all of a sudden, we see an ad come out on national TV, buy a pharmaceutical selling vitamins. Now, to me, they either were lying to begin with, or they're blatantly hypocritical for the sake of making money. Because if the vitamins were a waste of time, why did they suddenly start selling them? And charging a lot of money, because in my mind they're junk vitamins. My opinion is that they use synthetic vitamins which do not work well in the body, and in many cases can be toxic, especially the fat soluble like A and D. if they're a synthetic form, the liver can become toxic very rapidly from them, as opposed to natural vitamin A and D and also E and so forth. So here they come back and start advertising. You had Theragram coming out and all of these vitamins made from synthetics at a high price and pretty much worthless, selling them to the public because the public was buying vitamins. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that they don't really care what you take as long as they make money on it. And if they can control the vitamin market and they can charge big dollars for it, that's perfectly fine. And that's what they've done. Now, you see all kinds of ads for all of these different vitamins by pharmaceuticals today, and yet for all this time they argued that they were worthless. So that means they're either hypocritical, selling you worthless products, or they were lying to you when they said they were worthless. But I don't know. I have to bring this up, and it makes me wonder, you know, if I were a standard consumer and I saw this kind of contradictory stuff come out, it would make me begin to wonder on the integrity of the pharmaceuticals that are doing that. But now they're all making vitamins, and they're all selling them, and they're all making a lot of money because it's very inexpensive to make a cheap synthetic vitamin compared to taking it from natural sources. So anyhow, enough about the vitamins, but I'm only saying all this to say how big and how powerfully they tried to wipe it all out so that they had no competition. Now, some other things they did, unfortunately, but most people aren't aware. For years, they tried to keep dentists from getting licenses and operating as a separate profession, because they said, well, that's the practice of medicine. You need to be a medical doctor to do it. Even though they didn't want to pull teeth and they didn't want to fill teeth, they didn't want any competition. So they tried to put them out of business by not allowing them to get a license. The dentists finally prevailed. The psychologists, they did not want psychologists. They said, we have psychiatrists, we don't need psychologists. But we don't want the profession, and they worked very hard, and it took a long time for psychologists to actually get licensed. And they did not want podiatry, the doctors who specialized in feet. And so they worked very hard to keep them from ever getting licenses, which eventually enough schools developed and enough podiatrists came out, which incidentally was not originally called podiatry, it was called chiropody. Chiropody means done or treatment with the hand, like chiropractic means practice of using the hands to treat with. And so once podiatry moved from chiropody to doing drugs and surgery, they didn't like the name chiropody anymore, so they changed it to podiatry. But anyhow, they had a hard time getting a license to practice because, again, the doctors, even though they weren't particularly interested in treating feet, they wanted to keep control of the industry. Now, something that very few people know or even heard about, but several years ago, there was a move made within medicine, and they had some support of legislators that they could become a sovereign field, meaning they're not under government control. They could do anything they wanted, and they would have the final say on everything related to medicine, and no one could challenge it. And so they actually had some legislative supporters, which I'm sure they probably donated a lot of money to, who were willing to sponsor a bill that would make them sovereign. So the government would not be able to say anything about anything medicine did. They would have the absolute final word on all of it. However, some people got wind of the bill, and it did get defeated. But it was not something that ever got any press or on the news. Now, I probably sound like I'm really writing medicine heavily, and as an industry, I am. I believe they've become a ruthless, heartless, money-grabbing industry. That's my opinion. Now, that's to say that there's not some people in medicine who are conscientious and go into medicine to help people. However, unfortunately, they can get caught up in the system because the big medicine money is made in doing what medicine does. And that means you're more concerned with prescribing the drugs and doing the procedures and doing the tests that they recommend, as opposed to utilizing whatever is necessary to help your patient, whether it be diet, whether it be exercise, or whether it be herbs or homeopathy or whatever it might be. Instead of the doctor doing that, they want them to not do any of that, and they discourage it like crazy. And of course, as I say, the big money's not there. So people who do get into it, even with a better attitude, many times get caught up in the money side of it, and therefore they fall in line with the standard practice. I don't know, it sounds like, as I say, I don't mean to be negative, but I'm wanting to open your eyes, and that seems to be the direction that we need to go. I'm looking at my time. I'm guessing this is probably a 3-session broadcast because we really haven't gotten into some of the stuff that illustrates what I'm talking about. Now, we're going to look at some books that I believe are illustrating what I'm talking about. Now, here is my complaint. I just kind of drafted up what is my complaint against modern medicine as it's practiced today, not against individual doctors who try to do a good job with what they know and what they can do. And I say what they can do because in many, many states, I have seen doctors lose their license, and I've known them personally, because they did want to do and try to do what was best to help the patient really get well. And here in Florida, I've seen it happen, and in other states. In fact, I think I may have mentioned before, maybe not, but I know a doctor out of California. Several years ago, California medicine decided that there was only 3 ways to treat cancer, and that was surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, and that was it. Well, this one doctor who had a PhD from Harvard in biochemistry and also a medical degree from Harvard realized that he couldn't get people well with cancer doing those kind of things, so he started applying his knowledge in other ways, and they started to harass him. Eventually, they were able to take away his license, but they didn't want to stop at that. They were so vindictive that they actually wrote Harvard and requested that they withdraw his medical degree. They wanted to really punish him for working hard to get people well, and he had a huge amount of people who got well under his treatment. Anyhow, here's my big complaints. Number one is the profession, contrary to the Hippocratic Oath, which says, above all, do no harm to your patient, but it says a lot more than that. I don't think we've actually read it through step by step. All the doctors supposedly are to take that. I'm not so sure they all do today, but they were supposed to. But that is one of the big criteria. Above all, do no harm. Now, I'm going to be showing you, before we're finished, good information you can go to. I don't want you to take it at my word. You can go and read it, read the investigations, the research yourself. Many books have been put out, and you determine whether this is true or not. But they have done research on patients and other people who were not patients without their consent, and they did it in a deceptive manner, and the research they did was damaging and in many cases fatal. And this has been done a lot. And the material I'm going to be presenting to you, you will be able to find that out. The second item that bothers me is, as I mentioned a little earlier, no way of controlling the price on drugs or procedures. In this country, they can charge whatever they want. I'm just thinking, when I bring that up, of a few years ago, they came up with a procedure for cancer where they were, and cancer we're going to talk a good bit about when we get to the third portion of this broadcast, the next one. The cancer treatment was that you go to the person's bone marrow and take a sample of their marrow cells, and then you irradiate the whole body with radiation, which already was tried before, and that pretty much seals the doom of the person to do that. And then inject their bone marrow back in, and hopefully stop the cancer but do something to maybe help the immune system. Now that procedure was called experimental, and they were charging $100,000 for it. And insurance companies were paying it, even though it was an experimental procedure, and it did not, there were no good effects out of it that I know of. And usually the patient's going to die from that, because whole body radiation exposure is what they found way back when the people from Japan, from the atomic bomb drops, where people had full body exposure, that eventually, of course, they died of immune failure. And so the first organ transplant they tried was by doing whole body radiation. Of course, the people died from radiation poisoning. Anyhow, the procedure is not proven to be useful, but they were getting $100,000 a crack for doing the procedure, even though there was no benefit from it, in fact, only detriment. So it's interesting how they can get away with doing all this type of thing, and it's a big gripe of mine. My third big complaint is the idea of publishing false information or tainted research to sell expensive drugs and chemicals which can cause serious injury and death. And we're going to be talking about that in the next broadcast, some specifics about it, not just talking in general, but specifics. How they can use advertising to create a need that doesn't exist, and then go out and market a drug that's very dangerous to supposedly correct or manage a symptom which not only doesn't help the problem, but actually can in itself destroy your liver or be fatal. So that bothers me quite a bit. And also how that they can eliminate from the data any of the research findings that go negative to what it is they're wanting to sell, and or pay people to write or sign research that's not valid. And maybe you remember the doctor in England in recent times who published that a drug was not good, that it had a lot of problems, and they tried to destroy him, and it later was shown that they actually presented false information to try to destroy his reputation as a researcher and as a doctor. And so this goes on all the time, and we'll give some examples of what we're talking about. And the other big one that really bugs me is the marketing of people's DNA, cells, and organs for huge profits, and many times without their consent, and that the person gets nothing out of it, and the doctor can make millions of dollars out of their tissue. And there is a book out called The Body Bazaar, the marketing or the market for human tissue, and it will give you a lot of examples. And we'll also talk about a particular person, Henrietta Lacks, whose cells have made millions and millions of dollars, and she was so poor that the family couldn't even hardly afford to bury her, and doctors have made millions of dollars off of her cells. So we're going to be talking about this whole thing, and we're going to go into detail. So if you have some friends, relatives, or so forth that you think might want to know a little bit more about what's happening, you might want to send them to the next broadcast where we will be covering this. Now, I know we're out of time, and we don't want to run it way over. So I'm anxious to see you again. Now, I have several books on the desk here, at least 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, probably about 10 or 12. One in particular we're going to cover a bit called Politics in Healing, which is one of those ways that the cancer industry has suppressed any kind of therapies that would cut the price or cost and could actually get people well. And this book was written by an individual, Daniel Haley, who did a tremendous amount of research in bringing all this information together. So we'll talk a good bit about this, and there's a few other things that, besides the Body Bazaar, that will illustrate what I've been talking about. And then you go read it, and you reach your own decision. Anyhow, it was nice being with you again. I think we've expended our time. Remember to go to mindyourhealthcast.com, we continue, and we'll be adding this list of books on there. They're already sitting out here, and those will be added on. Look for Dr. Mendelssohn's material. I think you'll find it very interesting. This is coming from inside the medical profession. And in fact, most of these books are going to be either by doctors or doctor endorsed who have read and agree with the material there. And some of them you can't get anymore. A couple of them I'm going to tell you about. I don't think you can get anymore, but there's a good reason for that. And otherwise, remember that if you want to, you go to mindyourhealthcast.com and click to this broadcast, or you can click to our Alternative Health and Prevention website about the clinic and what we do. It was nice being with you again. Until the next time, be healthy and think about it.